Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth and last but not least day of the Future of Strategy event brought by Coriolis Technologies. Over the last 4 days, we saw an incredible panel and thought-provoking discussions on the new trade landscape post-COVID-19 on SMEs, which is the hardest hit group, the gaming of trade, and for the first time, I'm very excited to say, achieving sustainable prosperity. And happy Thanksgiving for everyone, for all of our friends in the US, and specifically to Harriet, our panelist, who has taken time off to join us early in the morning. So thank you for that. I'm Stephanie Hammond, your host for this working lunch session on the challenges in measuring sustainability. I'm an independent sustainability advisor and was previously head of international proposition at Santander. I'm delighted to be joined today by Harriet Resnick, who's based in the US. Harriet is a lawyer specialized in trade finance and environmental law. She is the co-head of the ICC Sustainable Trade Working Group. We're also joined by Hussam Sultan, who is head of commercial banking at CIMB in Malaysia, and who is passionate about sustainability, as I'm sure he'll mention. So we really want this session to be interactive, and I encourage you to put your cameras on and just jump in the discussion, sharing anecdotes and challenges of your experiences and trying to measure sustainability, because we know that it's just not an easy beast. We really want to come out of this session with a brief, if I may, to help us design a solution where we can have something that banks and companies can use in the very near future to measure and report upon climate-related risk. And before we start, I'd really like you to please go onto the chat and put in the chat box what your background is, whether you're a banker, advisor, a trade specialist, part of a trade facilitation organization. We'd really like to know so that we can target the discussions accordingly. So with no further ado, I will let Harriet introduce herself and tell us what sustainable trade means to you and why it's important. And then we'll move on to Hussam. Harriet, over to you.
Thanks, Stephanie, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And thanks for joining and happy Thanksgiving. Just my background is as a trade finance lawyer who became more and more interested in sustainability and environmental issues. And I actually took the opportunity to take an LLM master's in environmental law. And so have really been focusing on issues of sustainability as co-head of the ICC Banking Commission's working group on sustainable trade finance. Stephanie, shall I hand over to Hussam at this point?
If you don't mind, first to tell us what sustainable trade means to you, and then we'll move on to Hussam afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, so as part of the working group, we really started with a working definition of what sustainable trade means based on the Brundtland Report and going back to the Stockholm Convention. And the working definition of sustainable trade finance has really been finance which supports goods or services produced in a manner that minimizes adverse environmental or social impacts or risks, or that promotes environmental protection or social benefit. So with that sort of general framework, we've proceeded to try to develop tools and guidelines for the market to help banks on their sustainability journey. But it has become more and more clear that banks need some more, and the market in general needs a more finite definition of what that sustainable trade finance means. So we're embarking on a project at the ICC to come up with a more specific agreed framework that looks at the characteristics of sustainable trade finance in light of not of initiatives that are going on in the sustainable finance space generally, but with a focus on trade. And we can get into that more later.
Great, thank you so much, Harriet. Hussam.
Thank you, Stephanie. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's good evening for me here in Malaysia. It's 8:36 in the evening. So this is how far, I mean, if they told me that this session was going to be 10:30, I would still be here. That's how passionate I am about the subject. I came to Malaysia actually for that purpose. When I moved to Malaysia 7 years ago, it was with HSBC Bank. And at that time, we were trying to put together some kind of understanding framework, strategy for green and sustainable banking in Malaysia. And I can tell you we've come a long way in those 7 years as a banking sector here in Malaysia. The landscape looks completely different now than it was 7 years ago. By training, I am a graduate of civil and environmental engineering from UCL in London. So it goes back to those days. And then I did masters in Cranfield University in sustainable management for environmental management for business. Now I look after the commercial banking for SME, in particular SMEs here in Malaysia with CIMB Bank. And trade and trade financing and many other aspects of SME engagements with sustainability is an area of immense passion for me. I've learned a lot, and I think there is a lot to be done from what I can say. If you want my perspective of what trade, sustainable trade means to me, it's about striking a balance between the impact on the environment, the impact on the economy, the impact on SMEs, in such a way that you achieve optimal levels of growth while you don't make that much damage, to put it in a layman's language. The challenges, of course, is the lack of standards, lack of agreed definition, as Harriet mentioned. There is also very little awareness amongst the grassroots, the SMEs, the smaller ones, and the ones that this may not be their priority. So this is as I said, to me, it's about striking the balance, finding that balance. You see, when you talk in banking terms about a green loan, it's very easy to define. It's basically the use of proceeds. Green bonds, also in the market, they have sorted this out. They know what a green bond is for. The use of proceeds is usually the defining determinant of what this is all about. In trade finance, if you want to green trade finance, you will have a huge challenge because it's such a complex area. And there are many factors that should be taken into account. And I mean, as we go through the discussion, probably I'll give some examples, but this is my perspective now.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Hussam. So striking a balance, an optimal balance, and minimizing and promoting social benefits is where we can get to. And I guess another point to add is also not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, as Harriet, you mentioned the Bruns Bank report. So why is sustainable trade important now? Why are we having this discussion, Harriet, from your perspective?
Well, I think there's a lot of focus on it, and I'm happy to say I've seen the evolution of that. And I think banks are beginning to understand that just doing the BAU trade transactions is not going to be sufficient anymore. And I'm very happy about that transition, but it's a tough one. And I think that there's a lot of focus on it from the market, from regulators, and from NGOs. And all of that pressure is helpful, I think, because it's really focusing people's attention on this subject. That there's been a real coming together of regulators about the view that climate change creates a systemic financial stability risk, and that there's prudential concerns that banks have to identify and manage and disclose risks with relation to the impacts on their portfolios of climate change, on biodiversity loss, and other ESG issues. And I see these requirements evolving from voluntary to mandatory, whether it's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. There's a real chorus building to make that disclosure mandatory, so so banks and other financial institutions and companies are really talking about what are the risks that they're facing, physical risks, transition risks, and what are they doing about them. And this is supposed to be the super year for biodiversity. And there's a major focus now on, because of the degree of loss that we've suffered, because it's a driver of climate change, and because it's really linked to what we're all experiencing with COVID as a driver of a transmission of zoonotic diseases. So and the other, beyond disclosure, there are movements towards mandatory due diligence requirements. So in the UK, to try to minimize the impact that imports have on creating deforestation in producing countries. And the EU, I think, is sounding like they're going to have a generic mandatory due diligence requirement on companies that looks at both environmental and human rights impacts. So the pressure is on, and I think it's incumbent on us to really develop as an industry ways of managing these risks and coming up with standards that make sense for the industry before a standard is imposed that really on us that doesn't work.
Absolutely. I think we lost Hussam here. So while he joins, would you mind please explaining to us what the Scope 3 emissions are and why a company may have to pay attention to it and what this means to them?
I mean, this is a difficult question, actually, because can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a difficult question because when it gets to measuring the scope of your entire supply chain, you don't know where to start and where to end, and what is the minimum that you should start with. Also, you don't know whether you have sufficient information. If you have a global network, if you have a global supply chain, you don't know how far you can extract data that are useful, reliable, and also that could be used for verifying that the impact is real and that your emission or whichever you're trying to measure is real. So these are the challenges that we have here when it comes to Scope 3, is the data and the quality of the data and the reliability of the data. However, I don't think there is an escape from moving into that direction. I think it's an evolutionary process. You started with the, like many other companies in the past, they started with the easy steps, greening, there was issues with greenwashing, and then greenwashing, I would say, also served the purpose. At some point raised awareness and made people slightly, object to it or like it, or, raised awareness amongst consumers. Now it comes to that challenge of measuring the impact of the entire supply chain or your portfolio. For a bank, for example, if we want to measure the impact of our entire portfolio, and see whether, this is the argument, whether banks are clean because they only use electricity and papers, or they are the most polluters because they finance every polluter on earth. So if banks were to clean their acts, they will need access to that data. Then the question is, should banks be the ones sourcing this data, or should companies be incentivized to come up and disclose this data? And what role should the government play in facilitating this? What incentive should governments give to make sure that this is measured? And then there's obviously the other challenge is it all about CO2? Is it all about carbon dioxide? Apparently not, because although carbon dioxide is the measure, is the unit, carbon equivalent, metric tons of carbon equivalent. If you measure it over, say, a period of 100 years, the impact of other greenhouse gases over the same period of time probably have a more severe impact on global warming. So how do you measure that? And what are the sectors? Who are the contributors? It's not just animal farming, it's not just the agriculture sectors, but also landfill, which goes back to the waste. What do we do with the waste? How do we dispose of the waste in such a way? So all of these very complex matrices, if you want to build an artificial intelligence program to calculate all that. But the good thing here now is that big data is the new class of assets now. So everyone now realizes the importance of big data. It's available, but I would say that the availability of big data and the reliability of big data is not uniform across the globe. What you will find in Europe, in North America, is accessible, is clear, is defined. You may not find the same level of clarity and reliability in other parts of the world. How do you ensure how do you make sure that the governance of these disclosures are there? I think, it's not all doom and gloom. I think we have the fact that there is awareness. And at the end of the day, I think consumers will be the ones demanding it, and big players, including banks, will respond. So I think, to answer your question, I think data is a big factor here. The journey is still at its beginning. I look forward to see how this will develop. I don't have the full answer. I don't think anyone has, but there are a lot of good people there trying to design solutions for this.
Absolutely, and you mentioned quite a few points. So I'd like to first go at the stage in the value chain that we should be looking at, because as you say, CO2 emissions is only one element of everything else that goes in it. And when we look at the production of something, let's say if we take a T-shirt that's going to be sold in the UK, the production of the cotton, the monocrops that goes with it, the use of pesticides, the other chemicals that are used for the dyes and so on, all of this goes into the production and the transformation stage that doesn't even touch the UK, and that someone that is so remote has no idea of the impact that this has had on the community. So if we look, let's say, at Bangladesh, which is one of the biggest import partners for the UK with regards to clothing, they have seen a lot of flooding and so on that is due to the change in land use. So how do we get to a measure where we can, I guess, measure and quantify this, or give a rating, let's say a RAC status, green, amber, red, or a specific grade, let's say, at a production stage, extraction production stage, not just at the transportation stage, and not just, as you say, at the commercialization stage, where a lot of people will say, we're recycling everything that we have in our offices or premises. The packaging that we use is 100% recyclable, and so on. And then what do we do with the post-use phase? And so, for example, if there is no recycling facility in the country of where the goods are being used, what does this mean and how do we quantify this? Do we need to work on an individual, let's say, community or local authority basis or country basis? Harriet, where is the thinking of the ICC in this when they talk about sustainable trade? What aspects of it are they aiming to look at?
Well, what we've been focusing on is trying to help banks identify these types of risks and come up with mechanisms, due diligence guidelines, and tools that allow banks to talk to their clients about their sustainability policies, their capacity to deal with these issues, their track record, and with specific focus as well on the supply chain and where they're operating and where they see the high risks associated with their supply chains, including with respect to commodities that they use and source. And the way we're doing that is sort of two significant projects that we've been working on. One is what we call GMAP, which was a database that was developed by IFC, one of the members of our working group, and we're very lucky to have both commercial banks and multilateral banks participating in the group, as well as others with sustainability expertise. And GMAP, which is Global Map of Environmental and Social Risks in Agro-Commodity Production. I never remember it without having to check the full long name, but this is a database which provides information on the environmental and social and governance risks of over 250 country commodity combinations and scenarios, and really assesses, so for example, coffee in Brazil or palm oil in Indonesia and cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire. And it also contains information about that's derived from the International Trade Center's Standard Map database on voluntary certification authorities. So this database was prepared by IFC with the assistance of the World Wildlife Fund and was really designed to focus on IFC performance standards, number 2, which is on labor and working conditions, and number 6, which is on biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable management. And through public sources, there was really an evaluation of the risks associated with these commodities in these particular countries. So looking at issues like child labor, forced labor, working conditions, rate of expansion into natural areas, impact on protected areas, effect on biodiversity, and level of legal protection for all those issues. And the database, what the working group did was really come up with the idea of integrating information about what certification authorities are available to address those commodities in those countries, and do they cover the high risks that have been identified by GMAP. So it's not an endorsement of any particular certification authority, but it allows banks going into the database to evaluate whether the coverage of this particular certification authority is going to address those risks. So it's one tool that is kind of an eye-opener to begin the inquiry. If you find that your customer is importing cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire, you can look at that and say, oh, I've got to, focus on these high risks of child labor and deforestation issues. What are they doing about it? So the second tool that we've developed is a due diligence questionnaire. And this is something we're very excited about because it's about to be integrated into the SWIFT corporate KYC registry as a voluntary module. And it's really designed sort of on the KYC model to focus at the client level, help us to help banks identify high environmental and social risk associated with a bank's customer or within its supply chains, and what available mitigants there are. So it's really, we also help sort of evaluate the quality of the responses. So this is all qualitative data that you're getting with respect to a customer. What kind of policies do they have with respect to their suppliers? What track record do they have? Have they had violations or conflicts with respect to their supply chain? What board level focus is there on sustainability issues? So all of this information can now be submitted by a corporate to their bank through SWIFT. And it's an efficient way of gathering sustainability data, efficient for the corporate because they don't have to answer the same questions a million times, and efficient for banks because as more corporates do this, it enables banks to make an assessment of the where that customer is in relation to their peers. Are they doing enough? Are they outstanding, and therefore you really want to do business with them? Or are they kind of a laggard, and do you need to have a conversation with them and engage with them about where areas where you have questions or can come up with ideas on what their peers are doing and help them improve.
That's great. There's so much, as you say, that can be done, and our corporates forthcoming in giving this information is a question that I would like to ask Hussam. And second point is, I guess it's only if they know that their cocoa is imported from Côte d'Ivoire that's going to make sense. And in a lot of cases, as supply chains work, and we've worked on it on the multilateral platform from Coriolis, that is, by the way, if you haven't tried it out, it's there the whole week. So we were looking at UK imports of chocolates and cocoa, and actually most of the imports come from Netherlands and come from Belgium or Germany. So it's difficult to see that it's actually coming from Côte d'Ivoire. Although when you look at the supply chain and where is Netherlands or Belgium importing from, it will appear that it is from Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, etc., etc. So how do we help corporates see this, and are they doing the work themselves to try and get to this level, let's say, above who they generally import from?
If I go back to my opening statement about striking a balance, and I'll use your example that you mentioned about fashion. I mean, this is a very good. Now, how do you balance that? When you come to sustainable fashion, for example, you would expect, or you would think, that it's all about recycling the old clothes, because there's, people in their wardrobes, they'll have probably many clothes that they don't use. They just have sentimental attachment to them. And if that is what sustainable fashion is, then we're fine, but it's not. If we are to go back to countries like Bangladesh and tell them, look, you need to start putting all these green and stars, make scoring your activities, and we make sure that you treat your employees right. I'm not saying that this is not happening. I'm just saying if they put in place stringent standards, price will go up, and then us, the shoppers, we will probably be not so happy with Primark and the likes, which are consumer driven. Coffee, as it's another crop. Coffee is a highly demand elastic. It's a little bit of increase in price will have huge impact on the demand. And then what do you have? Coffee will become a luxury drink. Striking the balance, then if we just recycle clothing, and what will happen to the Bangladeshi economy? So how do we strike that balance? I think it's a long journey. We may not need to really be harsh on or expect corporates to do everything or expect banks to do everything, while consumer trends and consumer habits are still taking shape as we speak. I mean, it's not really there, and more so in Western countries, the consumer behavior and consumer awareness is a lot higher than it is in other countries. Priorities are different in developed versus developing or underdeveloped economies. There are certain mishaps. Let me give you an example here of a perfectly legal transaction. Must have been also gone through banking and was traded by legal entities. And a couple of years ago, there was a scandal when it was realized that the recycling or recycled plastic collected in certain economies in Europe and in Canada and North America, while the consumers did the right thing, they put the plastic in the plastic bin to be collected for recycling. What ended up happening is that those plastics were put in containers, were compressed, and shipped to another country. So it's not my problem, it's someone else's problem. There's nothing wrong with trading with plastic. There's absolutely nothing wrong with shipping and bill of lading of the commodity is plastic, the goods traded as plastic, the price, it's the banks will get involved, and there's absolutely nothing wrong there. However, it was not flagged as a red transaction, or this is when sustainable trade can come into it. You know what, guys, stop. There's something wrong here. What is like we say in banks, the use of proceeds. In trade transactions, the use of the commodity or the goods or the consumer goods, what is it used for? Where is it shipped? Full disclosure and awareness of what this is all about. I mean, consumer goods, whether FMCG or SMCG, they are probably the easiest to start with because they, highly consumable and we interact with them. What about the other top 10 commodities traded? The oil, the cars, the electronics. Who's measuring that? Who's looking after that and seeing so there's a lot of distractions in the discussion. And there is probably a dire need, as Harriet mentioned, that we need to start putting standards in place, prioritize what we need to look at. Like the standards for money laundering, needs to be standards for sustainability laundering or whatever you want to call it. But that kind of not allowing this kind of transactions to be facilitated by banks or transported. And then I think the change will happen over time. You cannot impose it or expect it to happen immediately. I think we are on the right track, though. I need to stay positive because this is the reality.
So you mentioned standards and so on. So world trade, 70% of world trade is supported by trade finance. What is your views, both of yourselves, what's your views on using the HS codes, which is also the mechanism that, it's the common standard that goes into trade finance, to actually measure sustainability and to get to a position of itemized, let's say, an itemized list of what goes in that could also be used potentially in a bill of materials that then go into life cycle assessments to define which option a company, which option a product is better, least impact that a product can be from a company perspective. What's your views on the HS codes?
I think it's a good idea, a brilliant idea, but who's ready for it? When we import from third world countries, for example, when we import from countries that rely heavily on certain practices, or they're not there yet in terms of imposing or implementing those standards, they're not incentivized enough to impose those standards as SMEs, as priorities of SMEs are, in different countries are, strikingly different. We've learned from this pandemic, COVID-19. One thing, like 3 years ago, if you went to in any sustainability discussion and you said to them, look, e-commerce is part of sustainability. You need to have your transactional website because it's part of sustainability. I say, no, sustainability is about all the environment, the protection, the carbon dioxide. Whereas we realize now, when the pandemic happened and the lockdown happened, a lot of companies that are not in the affected sectors like hospitality or travel and tourism disappeared because they could not continue to sell online. Whereas other companies that were future-proofed at that time, 3 years ago, and they put together, so thinking ahead also and prioritizing, thinking about the future, thinking about what will help my company survive. That's also part of sustainability. How do we ensure the sustainability of SMEs as businesses? How do we make sure that if we impose certain standards, HS standards, or they will not disappear, especially in countries where there's no framework to support them from regulators and the government?
Great. Harriet, what's your views on using HS codes? And do you think that we could get to a position where HS codes are potentially linked to an SDG?
Well, I know that there's certainly a huge need for traceability and transparency in supply chains. And there is work being done on mapping through public data of country of origin and their linkage back to companies that are responsible for deforestation, for example. So I think it's important to be able to have information available on underlying transactions that can allow you to link back the ultimate buyer with the sourcing. What I think we also have to do is support demand for sustainable goods and not just leave it to consumers to realize that this is what they need. It's a policy issue and it's a risk issue. Banks are faced with a host of different risks if they're dealing with companies that are not paying attention to their environmental and social impact. It comes up in project finance, for example. If you've got conflict because you're putting your project on land that affects local communities adversely or indigenous peoples adversely, you shouldn't be doing that for many reasons, including economic ones, because it's going to hold up your project. So you need to assess your counterparties, your clients, based on their resilience, their understanding of these risks, and how well are they managing them. But I think from a sort of macroeconomic point of view, it's really important to have the public policies and also the economic support of companies so that it makes sense for them economically to meet standards that certification authorities can provide, for example, but there's a cost to that. So who's going to bear that cost? Is it, ultimately the company that's buying those products? They certainly have an interest in getting a flow of sustainable goods. It helps them in their reporting, in their meeting their targets. And it's not an easy task to qualify for these certification requirements. They're extensive and growing because people understand the issues involved. So SMEs do need help there. It's education, it's technical assistance, and it's economic. But it's really important to grow that demand. And, there's a public policy role to be played there as well to subsidize that type of activity as opposed to destructive environmental practices.
I'm going to bring in here a question from the audience about, how much is measuring sustainability about traceability, and what sort of buying do we need to achieve from smallholders and cooperatives, and how easy is it to get? And I'm thinking here, maybe Hussam, based on, let's say, palm oil in Malaysia or Indonesia, etc. How do we get them to engage and to see the benefits of declaring this or having in place the right measures so that larger organizations can have this evidence and go back to their investors and customers with, that's a clean slate?
Thank you. You see, for Malaysia and the palm oil industry, and this is something obviously has made headlines for so long, it is mandatory now since December 2019 that all palm oil in Malaysia has to be certified sustainable. Now, that obviously is a government commitment. It was made to the United Nations. And when the government is committed to such goal, they put in place the right packages for the smallholders, for the smaller companies, for the cooperatives, in terms of the incentives, the support, the grants, and also the mitigants for any risk. The government has to play a big part in that transformation because it's a national policy. It's a major commodity that the economy is relying upon. So I think this is when we get to see the government playing its part as well, and the regulators, and being responsible towards those smallholders and farmers. To be left alone and expect them that they will comply with RSPO, for example, or MSPO in terms of the palm oil standards on their own, or as you mentioned, in the case of cocoa or coffee, or it will be basically killing those businesses and driving them out of the equation. So I think the government here has a big part to play, and the benefit is also for the government because this increases the level of export, and the government then will become more able to reach out to different economies and different markets. So I think the government's role is crucial here.
Yeah, and this brings in the first couple of fire chats this morning, there was this whole question about collaboration and how collaboratively we can get to a position where we change, where banks really can lead the charge on the basis of real sustainability values. So you mentioned government, you mentioned we have banks, obviously, we have organizations such as the ICC, we have other NGOs and so on. Who else do we need in this equation in order to get to a position where farmers and where we start implementing these solutions?
Well, I mean, everyone really has a stake in this. Awareness it comes from multiple parties, from education, from researchers, from scientists. They have a role to play in terms of clarifying, justifying, and also making sure that what the government is doing is backed by the right science. And it's not just driven by merely economic motivations. Who else needs to play? I mean, I think everyone needs to play a part in terms of raising awareness and getting everyone engaged in this equation. Banks have a special role in this because banks obviously they invest. Banks, they measure risk. They put a value to risk. They put a number for risk measurement. Banks and insurance companies, of course, and that's the big role there because they go through the rigor of putting a financial number. They're attached to that risk. Banks also influence stakeholders and company directors, and banks lend, invest, and banks also lose money in the sense that they are victims. So that's why they are a big part of this equation, and they're big influences in that. So governments, and I think the banks come straight after governments and regulators.
Great, and it brings us to another question of the audience here. Is there a real sense of mission at a bank's level, or is it simply a risk management? Do they really buy into it, or do they just do it because they have to?
The different banks have different motivation. I've seen some banks. I've had this discussion with banks, for example, in the Middle East, when I don't think it was. I think it was just a level of awareness and understanding. As Harriet mentioned earlier, their understanding of sustainability was, we recycle paper, we do CSR, we clean the beach every month, we send a team there. Whereas other banks would have had the pressure from NGOs, from regulators, from consumer groups to make some changes. Other banks will have pressure from shareholders. They will have large funds, investors, foreign, who are putting that pressure because it affects the value, it affects the reputation of the company, of the shareholders. Is there a sense of duty there? I think there is also. Yes, it is increasingly there. I think the evidence of the impact on the environment and social, and it's getting more and more there. I mean, I think, and thanks to big data for a lot of that, because the evidence now is clearer. Reports are there. You can just Google and find reports that will prove the impact on, not necessarily, we're not just talking about climate change here. We are talking about the impact on pollution, on the environment, on social, on employment, on so many things. So I think, yes, I think there is a growing trend amongst banks that this is a sense of duty now. This is the right thing to do. And also it's future proofing. It's not just because they all good doers, but also they realize that this is the right thing to do if you want to be in business in 10 years, in 15 years time.
Great. And so there were discussions yesterday in the sessions about the ASEAN region and how hard it is for companies in emerging markets actually to collect data. So how do we really help them bridge this gap, and what's the role of technology here as well? What can we do? I mean, banks have huge networks, speak to companies on a daily basis and so on.
I think that there's a real need to standardize the type of data. There were data requirements that we need from clients to understand their businesses, and to make those more customary as part of trade transaction information. So, do you know the country of origin? Is it easy to figure that out, the ultimate country of origin? Do you know the components of the major commodities that your customer produces, imports, manufacturers do. So that type of data is essential for you to really analyze what the potential issues are. And I think it's one of the things that that I think is kind of the holy grail is to get to a level of transaction screening that is efficient and doesn't hold up transactions, because nobody wants to do that, but is a level of granular detail that can be screened for red flags, or you know, in some way identify those transactions that may pose problems that need to be evaluated more carefully, so that trade bankers can talk to their sustainability experts in that case and figure out, is this really a problem or isn't it? So I think that's really the holy grail. And the type of information that banks may be getting about their transactions in the ordinary course may not be well suited to that type of analysis. So I think we have to really understand, you know, what are those data needs? Is there some way to standardize, whether it's, you know, in Swift message formatting, does that need to be changed, or just requirements that may not necessarily be commercial requirements, but are bits of information that we need, in a sense, for compliance purposes, just like KYC is needed for compliance purposes. This is whether it's a voluntary standard or perhaps mandatory due diligence obligations in the future, we're going to need the elements of data that allow banks to assess these sustainability risks.
See, banks are one of the largest manufacturers of big data, after mobile phone companies probably. However, banks waste 85% of that data that they generate. It goes to cyber dumpsters. They just don't know how to handle it. Ancient systems that are not capable of handle this level and that much data generated and processed that. So outsourcing at some point will be probably the best solution there for banks and financial institutions. But they cannot. I don't think while continuing to be in business, to invest in large. I mean, I've seen it with big international banks. It's a very, very difficult task to upgrade systems to be in line with what the fintech companies can do, or big data companies can do. So outsourcing probably will be the best way forward for banks.
Great. And how can banks, if we believe that that's their role, help those companies, their companies, actually record their data? How do we bridge this data gap?
I mean, banks will not, go to their companies and ask them to record data. Banks are still, to date, are very much paper-driven, paper-intensive. What we are doing, I mean, I'm speaking for my own projects that I'm doing now, is we are trying to develop certain toolkits so that SMEs can go online and do self-diagnosis. They answer questions, and then if they require further details or assistance, we can link them up with some of our partners who will be able to assess them. The idea here is that we collect information about where do they stand as companies. We can then create our own little heat map of our portfolio, see where are the areas of weaknesses and areas of strength. These are early stages. It's done with a very, very ambitious outlook, and the tools are very basic, but that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to capture data, help SMEs and help our customers understand their own business from a sustainability standpoint, and then see how we could work with them to improve on that, to build financial solutions around that, and to help them improve.
And so, where do we see things like blockchain solution and smart contracts across the value chain or the supply chain being there in the very near future, or is this still something that's kind of?
I mean, look, let's say, if you go back to like 30 years ago and say, you know what, there's something called emails, and there is 2 people around the world who have emails. How useful is that? They say, oh my God, that is so not useful. That's just rubbish. What am I going to do with emails? 2 people, 3 or 10 or 100? But look at it now. We can't do without emails. We can't imagine how life was before emails. Same thing I would probably think will happen with if you want a successful blockchain tracing network or distributed ledger, you have to have as many people or almost everyone on that to have a node on that so that they could be connected and you can have a meaningful transaction over that. I think there is future for that, but it will require the same level of evolutionary growth that emails have taken. Maybe not 30 years or 10 years, maybe less, but it requires some investment. It requires, whereas email was easier.
Harriet, any views on this?
Well, I've seen some interesting developments out there where sustainability information is included as part of the distributed ledger information, and that is great because if you can kind of get over the authenticity issue of certification information, for example, then which there was quite a number of years ago a product developed, Sustainable Letter of Credit, which had a feature of RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil certification stamp that would be put on the bill of lading. But the reliability of that is a question because we were dealing with paper documents and somebody could forge a stamp. But if you could have digitized certification information as part of the information that's looked at for the transaction approval process, that gets over that hurdle. So that I think that idea has caught on, and there's some interesting things going on about that, which is really, really encouraging.
Great. So we mentioned that, earlier you mentioned that banks are really the holders of the KYC and so on. Do we foresee them being the center of sustainability, mandatory sustainability disclosures as well?
I think that has to come from the corporates, but regulators are interested in how banks are managing risks, and both from a prudential perspective, how does an individual bank manage, identify, deal with its risk? How resilient are they? Just like they look at concentration risk and country risk, sustainability risk is part of that. What are the impacts that climate change are going to have on collateral? What credit risk are you facing from companies that whose products are based on use of water resources or biodiversity that's at risk? So there's a lot of issues that banks will need to look at. But also regulators are looking at a macroeconomic level at the fact that if multiple banks are, exposed in a particular sector to the effect of climate change, for example, what is that going to do to the value of their collateral? What is it going to do to their credit risk? And these things kind of affect each other negatively in a bad cycle. So regulators are going to be ensuring both on a systemic level and on a regulatory examination level, they're going to be looking at banks to see if they've got their act together on these issues. So I think that cascading that down then to your clients, you need the information that will enable you to answer those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm just going to open a few questions to the audience. Where do you think the biggest data gaps are for your organization? And what are the technology gaps that go with it in order to deliver on a solution that helps you manage and record sustainability risk? So would love to hear from you. If you can just unmute yourselves or just pop in the chat. And in the meantime, so all of this suggests that we keep on increasing trade, consumption, everything. One of the first principles of circularity is actually refuse. Does this mean that we should actually look at alternatives of GDP? How should we look at reinventing from a sustainability perspective, how on a more macro basis, how we measure growth, let's say, and growth in hyphens? Is growth what we should be measuring going forward, or is it something else?
I think growth is a human instinct, whether it's greed or whether it's just a normal business. Profit is what drives businesses, whether it's a corner shop or it's a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate global company, whatever. It's profit that drives. That's common between the very small company and the micro company and the big companies. Now, speaking about reinventing and coming up with new kind of way to measure this, I had this in terms of the accounting standards and in terms of the financial statements. Now, financial statements have intangible assets. It's you have the goodwill, the intellectual property, the brand recognition. These are all valued. They're translated into dollars and cents, yet they're not tangible. I don't see why we cannot have something that measures sustainability behavior that is included in that, positive and negative. Companies that perform well, they can get that as an income. Companies that misbehave or don't do well, absorbs some of their profitability. How is that going to be measured? How is that going to be calculated? Obviously, the experts will come and will make sure that this, I think, is what will make a change here, because it goes to the bottom line and it's part of the true cost concept, the calculation of the true cost, the true impact, and also the real value. So the true cost and the real value that is generated. We can take care of things like internalizing the externalities and measuring the real. I know there are challenges there in how we calculate these, and there's no one standard method. But we've got to start somewhere, perhaps, and that's when bodies like the International Accounting Standards can come into play, and such changes probably is what is needed going forward.
Great. Harriet, what are your views on this?
Well, I think there's some really helpful developments that are going on to recognize that the materiality of these environmental and social impacts, and to move towards integrating that into financial reporting. So bit of news I just saw is that the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board is merging with the International Integrated Reporting Council. They have a new name. I forget what it was. It's value reporting or something like that. So the notion, to just this idea of double materiality, that you don't just report on the financial impact to shareholders in kind of the classic sense, but you also look at what your impact and dependencies are, the major ones, not absolutely everything. And I think recognition that these costs, external costs, do need to be internalized to really understand the value that you bring. Do you have stranded assets? Are your operations so dependent on resources that are limited, that the value of your business model is questionable? So I think all of those things really need to be evaluated, and I think it will be really helpful to have recognition of the ultimate financial impact that the environmental and social aspects bring to companies' operations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, the materiality and double materiality. I'm just gonna jump on one question from the audience, and then I'm conscious of timings. You have Thanksgiving to celebrate, so we don't want to hold you for too long. So the question is, do you see a role for grassroots community organizations in building a local system of ESG data banks to help building a more trusted set of indicators? The role for grassroots community organizations to get to this ESG data bank and have kind of an independent set of indicators.
I think there is a role for everyone, and it's a collective effort here. The issue then becomes, when it comes to the grassroots, is what incentives do they have? What are the urgent needs for them to do so? Do they this data? So they could be part of a larger network of, for example, farmers or manufacturers or SMEs that are exporting or educational. Or so yes, there is definitely a role for that, but the end result has to be channeled to the right impact, where it can be felt and it could be utilized, and also the benefit goes back to that same community.
Great, thank you. And just to finish off, I would like to just mention the donuts economy model that looks at as an alternative to GDP potentially, that looks at the planetary boundaries not going above and not being under, so that it doesn't impact the communities. Yeah, we just leave with a hope message. Thank you so much for joining. Thanks for everyone for participating. Obviously, you can get in touch with us through Coriolis. Harriet and everyone in the US, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks.
We'll keep in touch. Thank you very much. Don't hesitate to get in touch with Coriolis. Thank you.